This is now part 2 of Chapter 9, Ethnic Relations and Race. Now what we're going to do from carrying on from part 2 is looking at ethnic groups in Canada. Now this isn't a limit of all ethnic groups, it's just looking at an introductory component about what's involved in Canada. And we're also going to look at racial and ethnic inequality that exists in Canada, and perhaps where do we see this in the future. Now again, some things to think about here. What are the unique experiences of the racial and ethnic groups in Canada? Because of course, not all people will experience the same thing in the same environment. And that's the same for all ethnic groups within Canada, and that includes Qubcois, Aboriginal, visible minorities, and we're going to look at all that variation and how it plays out in Canada. Okay, let's carry on with this, and good luck and carry on with your good work. Now in the part 2, we're going to look at how Canada is a nation that has become increasingly multi-ethnic. And we're going to look at 3 primary groups within Canada: the Aboriginals, more recently the appropriate title is Indigenous Peoples, the Qubcois, and the multicultural minorities. Now when we think in terms of Indigenous people, we're talking about the original occupants of Canada. And there's various terms that have been used: First Nations, Natives, and this refers to some 55 to 60 sovereign people. Now the Indian Act designates there being status Indians and non-status Indians. Status Indians are those with the legal rights under the Indian Act, and non-status Indians are those without the legal status. There's also the Métis, which are descendants of Indians and non-white unions, primarily French settlers and Indian women. And then there's the Inuit. Formerly it was a term used to describe people that we labeled as Eskimo. These are those located in the eastern Arctic and northern islands. Now there's some theories as to why there is such a drastic depopulation. Now one of the terms were used was genocide, and we've used this before in the previous part, where many were actually massacred or died with European diseases. There was also forced migration. This was the infamous Trail of Tears in 1832. The Cherokee Nation were forced to leave southeastern United States to Oklahoma. Forced migrations of prairie people into reserves to make room for European settlers. The Indian Act of 1876 gave control of almost every aspect of Indian life by the Canadian federal state. And then, of course, and as was mentioned in part 1, there was assimilation, and in this case, forced assimilation. The ideology that Aboriginal people were savages and uncivilized, that they were best to succeed if they became like Europeans. And so the residential schools were part of the joint project by Canadian government and various Christian churches to assimilate in a forced manner Indigenous people to the dominant culture. Now, certainly a lot of things have changed since then, many for the better, and it's not completely shifted around to where people of the Indigenous people are fully accepted and well received, unfortunately. So when we're thinking about Indigenous people today, by the 2006 census, some of the patterns starting to emerge regarding Indigenous populations, Indigenous people of Canada, they had reached 1 million people within Canada. Now that's North American Indian status and non-status was about 700,000, Métis about 300,000, and Inuit about 50,000, and it represents about a total of 4% of the Canadian population. And so it's shown a big jump in terms of the overall growth of Indigenous people in Canada, and that trend is appearing to continue to go. Now some of the characteristics that we can consider, they're considered in terms of the overall population, some of the more disadvantaged of Canadians in terms of income, employment, housing, nutrition, health. These are all very big issues, of course, because, of course, if it was affecting us individually, and it does for many Canadians, aside from just Indigenous people, it's very important issues. Life chances. Now, life chances, as was mentioned in the first video, is looking at things like education, things that allow us to succeed in life and perhaps lift us up from where we are to where we could be. And that's a life chance. There are less life chances for Indigenous people, 5 years or less than others. Now, the highest infant mortality rate is among, and disease rates are among Indigenous people, and limited educational opportunities. Now, all of these things are going to begin and have begun to have some shape and changes, but none of these changes are happening quickly enough for those who are experiencing them, and change typically does move rather slowly, given the kind of importance these issues are. Now we're going to look at the Qubcois. In 1608, the first settlement of French immigrants to Quebec City. After the 7-Year War of Conquest from 1756 to 1763, the British defeated the French. The French were allowed to keep their religion, their language, their culture, while the economic and political power was that of the British. There was the Quiet Revolution, a rapid modernization. This was in the 60s. Rapid modernization, industrialization, and secularization processes from the 60s to the 1960 to 1966. The most salient effect, the Quebec nationalism or the sovereignty movement, this process from the 1970s, the sovereignty movement gained momentum to the near success in 1995, where the Separatist Party, the Parti Québécois, governed Quebec until 2003, with the success of the Liberal Party and Jean Claret coming in after that. Now, this is only just a quick overview, and I'm sorry I don't go into more detail, but really we're only looking at what are the sort of groups that have emerged over years of being in Canada, and that's the second group, the Québécois. We can then move into some of the trends that we've seen more recently with visible minorities. Most Canadian immigrants today are members of a visible minority group, about 75%. And there's a change from the discrimination processes that we've established in the 1869 onward, where we can look at the discrimination of the Chinese, the Japanese, the South Asians, and the Jewish Canadians, to emerging to what would be considered a point system in 1967 that evaluates new immigrants without looking at ethnic, racial, or religious criteria. Now, immigration trends from 1929 to the present, we can look at the 1960s, where the majority of Canadians were from the United States and Europe. By 2001, the majority came from Asia and Middle East. When we think in terms of diversity in Canada, the patterns are demographically through Stats Canada. New immigrants tend to live in cities more than they do in the rural areas. The most common cities would be Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. They also happen to be the largest growing cities, not just due to immigration from other countries, but Canadians typically are moving from the rural areas to those three major cities in particular. In fact, I think it's 80% of the overall Canadian population lives in cities, and 60% of that 80% lives in those three major cities. So they are big cities. They are diverse, both in terms of rural and urban people, as well as visible minorities. Some of the effects, some fear, a backlash against visible minorities because of economic downturns. Oftentimes when we see economic downturns, there's a direction shift towards saying, well, if we didn't have as many visible minorities, we'd have more economic success. And that's a belief, but it's not bore out in facts. Ultimately, there's a more optimistic view emerging, and we see things, hope for a new tolerance, openness, and acceptance of all people. We see more cross-ethnic grounds of relationships, which, if you think in terms of the more we get to know people, the more likely it is we see the similarities rather than the differences. There's employment equity laws that are occurring. The freedoms of the Charter of Freedoms Rights are very important to Canadians. Much opposition to racism. We don't agree with it, although it still occurs. We still have laws that protect people as best we can from having racist experiences. And there's hopes to heal the broken relationships through the emergence of Indigenous groups that are supporting their own cultural healing. We see this in terms of what happens with the separatist movements in Quebec and language laws. Diversity in Canada is part of what makes Canada Canada. And there's optimism in that.